Welcome to this episode of Out of the Best Books, the podcast where we deep dive into classic literature and have conversations about what we've learned and discovered along the way. We love all things books and reading, and we want to share our love of the classics with you. We hope to inspire you to read along with us and join in the conversation. I'm Laura.
And I'm Amity. Let's get started.
All right. We're back.
Yes. Yeah. Quick review. We are in the midst of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Last week, we talked about the two suitors of Lucy Manette. Three suitors, really. Right. There was Mr. Stryver, who he kind of got shut down at the pass, fortunately. We had our gatekeeper, Mr. Lorry, who kept him away. We had Charles Darnay, who appealed to her father first. And her father was like, well, if she tells me that she loves you, then I'll let you know and you can keep pursuing it. And then we had Sidney Carton, who came to Lucy herself. It's face to face. And he's like, basically, I love you, but I also know that I'm a loser and I'm never going to amount to anything. So that's unfortunate.
He's like, I love you too much to subject myself to you.
Yeah, subject you to me. Yeah.
Where we left off was in the wine shop where that spy, John Barsad, had come in, and they knew he was a spy. They recognized him. We find out that Madame Defarge is coding things into her knitting, which I've been thinking about. How would that work? Was she actually knitting words, shapes of letters into her knitting?
Well, it's really interesting because there's so many different stitches in knitting. And so maybe she had specific stitches coming at specific times in order to, and she had some sort of code related to that. I don't know.
She could be putting other stitches in, but somebody else would have to know what she was doing. That's what I mean.
Unless you're that's why I'm wondering if there's sort of a code that she'd established.
He tells them that Lucy is married to Charles, and he also tells them that Charles is related to the Marquis, and she adds his name to her stitching.
Yes, that's true. Well, Lucy's not married yet. They said that she was going to
be married. Yeah.
And at this point, you can see that Monsieur Dufarge, he's very passionate about the cause of the people, but he still has his humanity to where he's like, but what about Lucy? That's going to be her husband. You can't just scratch him off. Jumping into chapter 7, which is called One Night. It's just the last night before Lucy is going to be married to Charles. She and her father are sitting under the plane tree, which I need to look that up to find out what that actually is. A plane tree, which is in their yard. Just enjoying this pleasant evening together the night before she's going to be married. And she's kind of doing this double check with him to be like, are you sure you're fine with this? Because she's like, I am very happy. I'm in love with Charles. She's very honest. She's like, I'm so happy. I'm very in love. But she's like, will you please tell me for sure that this is not going to get in between our relationship, that it's not going to affect you negatively? And he's basically like, I'm so much happier because you're going to get married. He's like, my biggest fear was that your life would waste away worrying about me. And basically you would throw away your life for my sake. And he says, I love this. He's like, how could my happiness be perfect while yours was incomplete? And I love that so much because that line encapsulates what real love is. Because in relationships, it has to be a two-way street where we're both working for the happiness of the other. And we have to realize that our happiness cannot be complete if the other is not happy. It's such a bizarre concept. It's hard to really understand, but it is true. You cannot be truly happy if your partner is not completely happy. And it made me think back to some of the other books that we've read, even some of the characters in this book that are not that way at all. You can see that they're very selfish people. They do not actually care about the happiness of their partner. They don't care about the happiness of anybody else. They purely care about their own happiness. Those who may have followed along with Far from the Madding Crowd, Boldwood just like is the poster boy for the whole, it's okay if you're not happy right now. This is going to make me so happy. And so the fact that it's going to make me so happy, I know that eventually you're going to be okay, and he's all about himself and like a more selfish kind of love I couldn't imagine. It's not even love, really. And then in this book, Stryver is the same way. Unfortunately, like we said, he was cut off at the pass. He couldn't even really pursue Lucy. In fact, we're going to talk about him a little bit later. It's so kind of funny, but also you could totally predict that he would act this way. But his reaction to everything. Anyways, I think it's just a wonderful illustration of what real love is. You cannot be truly happy while your partner's they are not happy. And of course, in this situation, it's the father-daughter relationship, but there's still like that potential for total selfishness. He could be like, no, you've got to see to me, and especially at that point in time where a woman was very much, I want to say slave, captive, servant, like all these sort of negative connotations, but
like she was expected to be subservient
very much
and just do whatever.
Yeah.
Whoever wanted her to do, you're supposed to just do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Dr. Manette is kind of like, I couldn't live with myself if I was to stand in the way of you being happy.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then in this moment, he starts actually opening up and telling her some of the grief that he suffered while being imprisoned. He doesn't really talk about the physical aspect of it, but just the mental aspect, thinking about, he didn't even know if his child, Lucy, had been born alive. He didn't know if his wife made it through the birth. He didn't know any of that. And so that like tortured him. But as time goes on, he's like imagining this little girl growing up, not knowing him, and just all the regret that he has attached to that. And he talked about like, he would look out the window of his cell and just imagine this little girl not knowing him but knowing of him. And he's so worried that eventually she will grow up and think that he abandoned her, even though, all of this was completely beyond his control, but he just has this nightmare that his little girl is going to think that her father abandoned her.
One thing that's interesting is like, we didn't know before this that he knew his wife was pregnant. So now we know that he knew that they were going to have a child. And
yes.
Yeah, he imagines her as like an adult with children.
Mm-hmm.
It's really sweet.
He says, she showed me her children, this image, this fantasy that he had of his grown-up daughter, who's Lucy, and they had heard of me. So she showed me her children, and they had heard of me and had been taught to pity me. When they passed a prison of the state, they kept far from its frowning walls and looked up at its bars and spoke in whispers. She could never deliver me. I imagine that she always brought me back after showing me such things, but then, blessed with the relief of tears, I fell upon my knees and blessed her. They just have this really sweet moment where he's like, and it really does all tie back to that theme of recalled to life, right? Like he thought his life was going to be completely spent in the prison. That's where it was. And so he had sort of imagined this beautiful life for his daughter that he never knew. And it ended up that he's able to rejoin her. Of course, there's a lot that he ended up missing, but he still was able to, he's able to see her get married and have children. And so he is recalled to life, and she's recalled to life for him because he gets to see her and she's living the life right in front of him. Anyway, so they're both, it's good. It's very sweet. And we also just sort of the last, I think, one of the more important parts of this is just that we understand that the wedding is going to be very, very small. It's just going to be Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, and that's all. Just that paragraph right before it
Was it
talks
before
about
that?
how into his handsome face the bitter waters of captivity had worn.
There it is.
But he covered up their tracks with a determination so strong that he held the mastery of them even in his sleep. So it's like he's like exercising so much control, even over the muscles of his face, to try to move past that trauma of the captivity. So
Yes, I know. I think about like a lot of, I don't know, books, movies, or whatever, like the night before a wedding or the morning of a wedding. There's a lot of like deep conversation going on. So that's what was going on.
yeah.
They were having a deep conversation, and like, I guess you're on the eve of knowing that tomorrow things are going to change.
Everything's going to change. Yeah.
We're moving into chapter 18. The title is 9 Days. Okay, so this is the day of the wedding. And if you remember a few chapters back, when Charles had said, I want to tell you who I really am, and Dr. Minette says, if you marry Lucy, you can tell me on the morning of the wedding. So they go off to speak privately. They also talk about they're going to go on their honeymoon. And so Mr. Lorry is kind of reassuring them that they're going to take care of her father while they're gone. That happens before. So now Mr. Darnay and Dr. Minette go into a private room. And when they come back out, Dr. Minette is very pale. And he looks deathly pale. And when he went in the room, he looked perfectly normal. So they know that what happened in there was upsetting. So the wedding happens, which I think is hilarious. It's like 2 sentences. Not a big thing. And then Charles and Lucy leave for their honeymoon, and they go to Wales on their honeymoon. And the plan is for them, I think, to be gone for like 9 days or 10.
Well, it was like 2 weeks for them to be gone. And
right. But he was supposed to meet them.
Yeah.
After 9 or 10 days. I don't remember which one it was, but it was the old, scared, lost look that troubled Mr. Lorry. And through his absent manner of clasping his head and drearily wandering away into his own room when they got upstairs. So I believe they left, and then Dr. Minette starts acting funny. And Mr. Lorry's like, what's going on with him? They notice that he's acting strange. So Mr. Lorry goes to check on things at the bank. And when he gets back, Miss Pross is concerned. She says, oh me, all is lost, she cried she, wringing her hands. What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me, and he's making shoes. So Dr. Bennett is back to making shoes, and he doesn't know who Miss Pross is. And so they're like, what are we going to tell Lucy? This is not what we were expecting, not what we were planning on. So they decide that they're going to keep it a secret that Dr. Minette is not doing well. I think they're just hoping that he'll come out of it.
Yeah.
Because he does. He goes into this and then he comes out of it, right? A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're just hoping that he will improve. Mr. Lorry, then he decides he's going to take some time off from the bank so that he can really be home watching Dr. Minette, because I think he's scaring them to death. And days and days go by and he's not getting any better. I liked the exchange where Mr. Lorry keeps asking him if he wants to go for a walk. Do you remember this little conversation? He's like, do you want to go out for a walk? And he's like, out? I think, he's right. He thinks he's back in prison, right? Kind of. So he's like,
sort of back in that mindset.
Yeah. Why would I go out? He says, yes, for a walk with me. Why not?
He won't. And
yeah, it says the time went very slowly on, and Mr. Lorry's hope darkened because he's not getting better, and his heart grew heavier and grew yet heavier and heavier every day. The 3rd day came and went, the 4th, the 5th, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days. And I think that's when he's supposed to go meet them on their honeymoon. So now they're like, what do we do? The last little part of this chapter says the secret was well kept. So they, like I said, they decided they were going to keep a secret from them. And Lucy was unconscious and happy. but he could not fail to observe that the shoemaker, whose hand had been a little out at first, was growing dreadfully skillful. So he's getting better at making shoes. And that he had never been so intent on his work, and that his hands had never been so nimble and expert as in the dusk of the ninth evening. So maybe he's deeper into it than he has been before. I don't know. That's probably
well, it's kind of interesting because he would look up where when he was in the garret, like, he wouldn't look at them. He would look to both sides, and he would do that at this point in time. He would like look down, look left, look right, but he would look up a little more than he ever had before. And it says there seemed a faint expression of curiosity or perplexity, as though he were trying to reconcile some doubts in his mind. And so it was like he knew there was something off, but he is very deep into this mindset, and it's very hard to come out of, but it's almost like somewhere in his subconscious he's like, this is not quite right. So I think it's maybe a sign that he's starting to get better, but he is still very deep into it. Well, we'll talk more about it. But oh my gosh. The third time that thing has fallen down. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about too is, if you remember, like in the first couple of chapters, when Mr. Lorry is in the carriage on his way to go and retrieve Dr. Manette from France, he keeps having these dreams, almost like nightmares. And in the nightmares, he has conversations with a man who we later learn is Dr. Manette. And the conversations are like the same over and over and over again. And we just got that again, didn't we? With these conversations that he has. Yes, they're exactly the same. Yeah, it is almost like a living nightmare, which is what Dr. Manette experienced for all those years, a living nightmare, and which they're going to be experiencing more later on. All right, so chapter 19, an opinion. I really loved this chapter. So Mr. Lorry is just exhausted. It's the 10th morning. He and Miss Pross have been taking shifts, back and forth. They're just constantly watching Dr. Manette. So Mr. Lorry wakes up on this 10th morning, says he rubs his eyes and rouses himself, but he doubted when he had done so whether he was not still asleep. He thinks he's still dreaming because he looks up and sees the doctor is sitting up and he's reading. He's just reading at the window, and he's wearing his normal clothes. His face is very studious and attentive. And Mr. Lorry is like uncertain. He's like, maybe this is just a dream because I haven't gotten much sleep lately. And so maybe this is not really happening. What I do know is that for the past 9 days, this guy has been just making shoes and walking up and down and totally not himself. And now all of a sudden he's sitting there just reading a book like everything's fine. Miss Pross comes in, and that's when he knows, okay, this is not actually a dream. This is real. So he decides to take this opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Manette. And basically he's like, okay, I need your opinion on something, which is why the chapter is called An Opinion. And he's like, basically, you are a doctor, so I need your advice. I have a friend, and he's been having some issues with his mind, and these issues really affect his daughter. So maybe you could give me some advice. And really, in that moment, Dr. Manette knows that he's talking about him. But the entire chapter, they talk about Dr. Manette in the third person, and I think that makes it a little bit easier for them to converse about this issue. So the doctor is like, okay, tell me everything. Don't spare any details. He doesn't remember what he was doing, right? So Mr. Lorry just jumps right into it. He's like, basically, it's the case of an old and prolonged shock. He has recovered. He's a very intelligent man. He's capable of close application of mind and great exertion of body, and of constantly making fresh additions to his stock of knowledge, which was already very large. But unfortunately, there has been a slight relapse. And Dr. Manette is like, oh, how long? He's like, Mr. Lorry says, 9 days and nights. That's a long time. Then the doctor, wants some details. He's like, have you seen this relapse before? Does his daughter know? Mr. Lorry says, no, we never told her. And then Dr. Manette wants to know, how does this relapse come about? Like, how does this man, who he knows is him, sort of regress into these episodes? It's Mr. Lorry who says to Dr. Manette, how does this relapse come about? Is there danger of another? Could a repetition of it be prevented? How should a repetition of it be treated? So really, he's trying to be very proactive to really help Dr. Manette so that this doesn't happen again. And so Dr. Manette tries to give him the best advice that he can as a doctor. And basically he tells him, I believe that there had been a strong and extraordinary revival of the train of thought and remembrance that was the first cause of the malady. And so I really think that what he's saying is basically it took him back when his daughter left on her honeymoon. It really took him back to when he was in prison and he didn't know where his daughter was. Like he didn't even know if she'd been born, didn't know what had become of her. And so just her leaving on her honeymoon had brought that all back. And it just left him completely helpless and in a horrible mental state.
That's interesting because I was thinking it had something that makes more sense because in my mind, I was like, it had something to do with him being shocked about who Charles Darnay was. But no, it probably had more to do with the fact that Lucy was missing.
Well,
Gone.
now that you say
Yeah.
that, though, it's probably a combination, honestly.
Yeah.
So
I hadn't even thought of that though, that it was just her being gone. Possibly.
well, so this line right here is what made me think it's mostly has to do with her being gone, because he says he tried to prepare himself in vain. Perhaps the effort to prepare himself made him less able to bear it. And that's why I'm thinking he knew that Lucy was going to get married, and he's probably mentally preparing himself for that for a long time. Now, she and Charles are going to live with him. She's not going to be gone forever.
Yeah.
They're going to be right there, but just even her being absent for a while, that's just enough. And he knew it would be hard. So he's like trying to prepare himself, but it's one of those things, you meet your destiny on the road to trying to avoid it,
Yeah.
So then Mr. Laura's like, okay, so what do we do in the future? He's like, maybe this guy needs to slow down a little bit. He does a lot. He's a doctor. He helps people. He's studying all the time. Is he doing too much? And Dr. Manette says, no, I don't think he's doing too much. I think that all these things that he does are actually really healthy for him and helping him to be as normal as possible. What it comes down to, what Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross decide, and really with Dr. Manette, while Dr. Manette goes out for the day, Miss Pross and Mr. Lorry destroy the workbench. They just destroy the whole thing. And they burn it all so that it is out of sight, out of mind, and it's not something that he can return to as sort of his little worry stone. And they feel like that's going to be the best thing.
One thing is they ask him, like, would it be better for our friend if we got rid of the tools? And Dr. Manette's like, yeah, I think so, but do it when he's not there.
Right. And so they purposely wait until he's out for the day. And so they do it with his permission, really. It says, on the night of the day on which he left the house, so Dr. Manette has gone, Mr. Lorry went into his room with a chopper, saw, chisel, and hammer, attended by Miss Pross carrying a light. There, with closed doors and in a mysterious and guilty manner, even though they are doing it all in good faith and for a good reason and with permission, Mr. Lorry hacked the shoemaker's bench to pieces, while Miss Pross held the candle as if she were assisting at a murder, for which indeed, in her grimness, she was no unsuitable figure. Which I love that description, because she is someone who could assist in a murder. That's very believable. The burning of the body, previously reduced to pieces convenient for the purpose, was commenced without delay in the kitchen fire, and the tools, shoes, and leather were buried in the garden. So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds, that Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and in the removal of its traces, almost felt and almost looked like accomplices in a horrible crime. So they felt like they were doing something horrible. It looked like they were doing something horrible. They were actually being such good friends, and they were looking out for the well-being to the best of their ability of their friend, Dr. Manette.
Yeah, I just loved that they were like, I mean, it was like reading about them murdering somebody, right?
Yeah.
Like we buried this over here and we burnt this over here, and we're like covering all our tracks.
Yeah.
I thought it was very funny. So chapter 20, a plea. Lucy and Charles get back from their honeymoon, and who do you think the first person that shows up is? Of course,
It is
it's
so
Sydney Carton.
funny. Yeah. Sydney
You know,
Carton.
I'll bring this up later, but he this is so dumb, but he kind of reminds me of like Twilight, and how she had the two, she had Edward, and then she had
Oh, Jacob.
yes,
Right?
he's
Is that-
Jacob. he's like number two, right? Mr. Carton reminds me of Jacob from Twilight. He's the first person that comes, and he is like, he apologizes for all the past times that he's come and he's been so drunk. And then him and Charles have this conversation about like, he's like, well, you remember that one time when we had dinner and I was really drunk? And he's like, and that conversation was bad. Can we just forget about it?
Yeah.
And Charles is kind of like, I already have. Don't even worry about it. He says, I forgot it long ago. And then he basically asks if they can be friends. I think because he wants to still be in Lucy's life, right? And so he's like, I'm gonna have to make friends with Charles, or I'm not gonna be able to come and visit. And so he asks if he can be friends, and then if he can visit occasionally, if he can come and visit. And I'm trying to remember anytime Carton is in, written in or whatever, he is like telling everybody what a worthless man he is. Genuine truth, Mr. Darnay, trust me. I have gone aside from my purpose. I was speaking about our being friends. Now you know me. You know I am incapable of all the higher and better fights of men. If you doubt it, ask Stryver, and he'll tell you so. He just has this horrible opinion of himself, and he's like willing to tell. It's almost like I do this too. Okay. And humans do this a lot, where it's like, I'm afraid you're going to judge me. So I'm going to quickly tell you that, like, if you think I'm dumb and I don't know this is what's wrong with me, you're wrong. Because I know this is wrong with me, right? Like, if somebody comes to my house and I'm like, you kind of say, like, I know my house is a mess, right? Like, you don't need to say that, but it's almost like if you acknowledge the fact that you know it, then they're not judging you. I don't know. I'm not explaining it.
No, I know. It's almost like you get out in front of it.
Yeah.
To be
let's
like,
get
no,
the elephant out of the room.
Yes. Like, I know. Okay.
I know I'm a loser.
And maybe part of that too is because we do observe people who do seem to not know. And maybe they do. Maybe we're just judging, or maybe we're totally judging. But there do seem to be people who are sunk really deep in things, and they just
Don't seem to know.
don't realize, or they don't know how to get out of it, or whatever. And maybe we just feel like, well, if we get out in front of it and just acknowledge, I know.
Yeah, you're almost like you're afraid that they're going to think you're a fool if you don't know that there's something wrong with you. I don't know.
And maybe that's our own insecurities, because maybe the people that we think don't know what's going on with their life, they totally do. And we're just the ones that are being foolish. But
I just thought that was funny. It just reminded me of that. He's constantly saying, I know I'm a loser. Don't let me fool you. I already know.
Yeah.
So he asks if he can visit occasionally. And Charles says, of course you can, right? I don't mind at all. And so that night at dinner, Charles mentions to Lucy and Dr. Manette and Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross that Carton's behavior was weird and
Mhm.
strange. And then later that night, Lucy says to him, like, I asked Charles to have faith in Mr. Carton. He says, I think Charles, poor Mr. Carton, deserves more consideration and respect than you have expressed for him tonight. And then she later asks, I would ask you, dearest, to be very generous with him always and very lenient on his faults. Because if you remember right, he had said that he would do anything for her.
Yeah.
Like he would lay down his life for her. So she kind of feels obligated to him, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, at least to be nice to him. I would ask you to believe that he has a heart he very, very seldom reveals, and that there are deep wounds in it, my dear. I have seen it bleeding. I just think those are great words. Um, and then he just kind of says later, like, Lucy, you're so amazing because you're so generous and so kind-hearted. And I heard somebody say that, you know, in this book, every character has flaws
Mhm.
except for Lucy.
Except for
So she's a little hard to love as a character because she's just perfect.
too perfect.
Yep. But this is an example of like, of course she's perfect. But yeah, he says he's just like, I'm so impressed with you. Remember how strong we are in our happiness and how weak he is in his misery. I think she says, yeah, she says that. Like, look how happy we are. We can feel bad for him and have
Yeah.
compassion.
Yeah, we can have compassion. Exactly. We have enough strength
Yeah,
and enough love between us that we can extend that to others, which is what we're all striving to do. We
I
should.
love that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the end he says, God bless her for her sweet compassion. She's so perfect in every way.
Okay. Chapter 21. This is a pretty wild chapter. It starts out, I kind of love how it starts out. So there's sort of a reminder of this corner where the doctor lives. And in this corner, Lucy, so their house, it sounds like, is in a corner, but I believe there's like a corner in their house that they can just hear echoes. They can hear things coming from a long way away. Maybe it's just where their house is built too. I don't know. But so Lucy sat in the still house in the tranquilly resounding corner, listening to the echoing footsteps of years. And I can't help but think about, like, just that the echoing footsteps of years. Have you ever seen Hoosiers, the basketball movie?
No.
So it's such a good movie. I don't even know when it was made, 60s, 70s, I don't know, early 80s, whatever. But it's about this basketball team, but it starts out with this little boy bouncing a basketball in this very old gym. Because it's a true story that takes place, I think, in the 50s. And very old gym. And he's bouncing the basketball and it just echoes through the whole building and goes on to like tell the whole story of this team from this very small town who, sort of just this little scrappy basketball team. There's not a whole lot of talent to go around. There's a couple that are pretty good. They just work so hard and they end up winning the state championship. And then at the very end of the movie, you go back and there's this little boy in this very old school bouncing the basketball and you hear like in the background just the voices, some of the conversations that like the coach had with his team, throughout the movie. And that is what this makes me think of. It's like the echoes of what happened in this old school, what happened between this team. And it just kind of makes you feel nostalgic, even though you weren't there. And so that's kind of what this makes me think of. And it sort of is also a montage of the over the years, because here's Lucy sitting in this corner hearing the echoes of things that have happened and that are going to happen. And so we understand that she and Charles had a baby, a sweet little girl named Lucy Jr. And she's just this sweet little angel girl. And then they have a little boy and it's so sad. I can't read it because I'm probably going to cry. So I'm not going to read the direct quote, but basically this little boy, he passes away when he's just little, but he's old enough to talk.
Yeah.
And so he had to have been, I don't know, maybe
7.
4,
Oh, yeah.
maybe 7. Yeah, I don't know.
You're right. He just says some pretty mature things.
He
So it's like,
does. He does. You don't know how much of that is just the author or if he was really trying to be super accurate. I don't know. So it says the rustling of angels' wings got blended with the other echoes. So the rustle of the wings of her sweet little boy who was taken to heaven. It talks about how the echoes rarely answered to the actual tread of Sidney Carton. So he had asked if he could come uninvited to their home whenever he wanted to. And he's like, I'll probably won't do it any more than like 4 times a year. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. It says that he didn't come that often, but it was probably like 6 times a year that he did, come to their house. And it says that her children, even the little boy, he had gotten to know him well enough that they sort of had this sense. What does it say? A strange sympathy with Sidney Carton, an instinctive delicacy of pity for him. And they were really sweet to him. They kind of loved him. And I think that he loved them too. Oh, go ahead.
This is the part. Well, I have a couple things to say. This is the part that
Yes.
reminded me of Jacob in that movie.
Okay.
Because he later in the books, oh gosh, I'm admitting a lot here.
Don't
Jacob
worry.
imprints on her daughter.
Okay.
So it just reminded me of this a little bit. But this is really interesting. When I was a child, I had a cousin. I have a cousin. He's close to my dad's age.
Oh,
but
wow.
he's my dad's nephew, right?
Mhm.
So my dad's the second youngest of 7, and
Oh, that's right.
this
Okay.
cousin is a child of the oldest son. So my dad had a plastering business, and so it was like a family business, kind of like all the boys and nephews had learned how to plaster, and so they would especially the nephews would work for their various uncles all the time. And my cousin, his name is Johnny, he would stay with us a lot. We had 2 cousins. My dad also had it. So that was his nephew. Then my dad also had a cousin that would stay with us. And I was little, and it was like this. I loved them. And I have these memories of my cousin Johnny swinging me. He would pick me up and swing me between his legs and up, and I loved it when he came. And this paragraph just totally reminded me of him and I don't know, the sweet relationship that I had with him.
But that's a great connection though. So we kind of catch up with Mr. Stryver too, as we're talking about echoes and things that have happened over the years. He and Sidney Carton are still working together, but Mr. Stryver has become very successful, very wealthy. He's married a widow who had 3 sons. And he kind of tried to pawn them off onto Charles Darnay. And he brought them over and was like, here, you tutor them, take them away. And Charles Darnay was like, no. And I'm not totally sure why, if it's just because he didn't like Mr. Stryver or what, but it says there was just a polite rejection.
I'm so impressed. I totally missed that.
Oh,
good job.
Okay. So, but then also in that, and this is kind of what I was referring to before, he was very offended that he was rejected by Mr. Darnay, that these kids were. And so he says to his kids, well, to his stepkids, beware of the pride of beggars like that tutor fellow. And then he would also say to his new wife over his full-bodied wine, he would talk about the arts of Mrs. Darnay and what she had once put in practice to catch him, and on the diamond-cut diamond arts in himself, madam, which had rendered him not to be caught. So basically, he's trying to tell his wife that Lucy was after him.
Of course.
Not true. Of course he did. Of course he did.
That goes right along with him saying at the end of that conversation when Mr. Laurie's like, I don't think you should, I don't think you should approach her or whatever. I don't think you should try to get her. Him just saying, oh, she wouldn't be good. And it totally goes with that conversation.
Yeah. So, and then we kind of catch up on Lucy herself, and it just really, she's such, like you say, she's kind of perfect she runs her household smoothly and beautifully, and everyone's like, how does she act like we're the only one in her world, but she treats everybody that way, and she has all the time in the world for us? What is the magic secret? Well, wouldn't we all like to know? How do you do it, woman? Maybe that's why you're a fictional character. Anyways, okay. And then we catch up with Mr. Lorry, and it refers to this great storm rising in France. Mr. Lorry rushes in one day and talks about how Tellson's bank is like almost overrun because all these people from France are like transferring their funds to them because there is some nastiness on the horizon. Also, it is now 1789. That is important to point out.
Yeah, so they're trying to, okay, I'm asking this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it said that they were, or I read, I don't know, it said that they were trying to protect their assets, their money, right?
Mhm.
And so now I'm understanding it. They're moving it to
Yes.
Mr. Lorry's bank because they're moving it from France.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They know
Got
there's
it.
some nasty stuff on the horizon, and so they're trying to protect their assets and get it to England while they can.
Okay.
Okay. So from there, so there's sort of this conversation going on, but then it transitions us from the dark London window to Saint Antoine. And this is when they storm the Bastille. Okay.
Yes.
And it describes the mob, and these people, just their arms are up and they're holding knives and anything that they can make work as a weapon. Muskets with powders and balls, bars of iron and wood, knives, axes, pikes, every weapon that distracted ingenuity could discover or devise. That mob mentality that we talked about before, they are storming the Bastille. And it's all kind of beginning right there at Defarge's wine shop. We understand that he and Madame Defarge herself are the leaders of this insurrection, right? And so they go, and Madame Defarge is like, I'm going. She's like, I'm going with you. You shall see me at the head of women by and by. And Defarge says to everybody, patriots and friends, we are ready. The Bastille. So they storm the Bastille. They're fighting and fighting. It says for 2 hours and then 4 hours. And they slowly are making progress in getting through. And they finally do. And one of the first things, it goes into pretty good detail in talking all about it. The flashing weapons, blazing torches, smoking wagon loads of wet straw, shrieks, volleys, execrations, just all these things they're trying to get in. Finally do. And one of the first things that Defarge does, he wants to see the North Tower. He says, what is the meaning of 105 North Tower? And so this man that's working in there, he takes him up there, and of course there's still lots going on, lots of fighting
Mob.
and everything all around them. What's that?
Mob activity.
Mob activity, absolutely. And they talk about, they say the prisoners, the records, the secret cells, the instruments of torture, like, let's get them all, release all the prisoners, things like this. And something that you had pointed out before, this Jacques 3, and of course, Monsieur Defarge is referring to everyone as Jacques 1, Jacques 2, Jacques 1000, whatever. So here's Jacques 3 again. He has his usual craving on him, this craving for bloodshed. He wants Monsieur Defarge to actually kill this guy who's taking him to the North Tower, because it's like, you either show it to me or I'll kill you. The guy is going to show him, and Jacques 3 is disappointed because he wants to kill this guy because he's very bloodthirsty. So they do go up to the North Tower, 105, which is where Dr. Manette was kept. And they kind of like, they look around, they see everything that's in there. There's like a bed and things like that, and a table. And there's like a fireplace. They like root around. They look through the mattress. They look up through the fireplace. They're looking to see if there's anything, like any writing or anything that was left behind. They don't find anything. Like, they beat the table to pieces. They rip across. They rip open the straw mattress. They don't find anything, so they just burn the stuff that's there.
They do. I mean, they find in the stone is carved AM, right?
You're right. They do,
but they don't find anything else.
Yeah. And so that is their indication that is where he was, Alexandre Manette. And So that was definitely his cell, but they don't really find anything else.
Yeah, they just kind of pile everything in the middle of the room and set it on fire.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, and then the mob starts to leave. And this is where it gets pretty nasty.
Yeah,
But it's true. Like, this part is true.
I think we find somebody else is also bloodthirsty.
Very. And it's very disturbing to me. But they've got the governor of the Bastille and several others in their mob nudging him on. They're going to take him to the Hotel de Ville for judgment. They're just like shoving him on. And then they start hitting him with everything. And they start stabbing and hitting him until he dies. It kills him. He drops dead under all of this, barrage of torture. And Madame Dufarge has been by the governor's side the whole time, witnessing all this, being a part of it, making sure he doesn't move, and she doesn't move. And as soon as he falls dead, she puts her foot on his neck and cuts his head off with her knife. That's disgusting. I don't know how much of that is factual, but then what we know is that they then put the heads on pikes to parade them around town. So they have, it talks about there's 7 and 7. There's like 7 prisoners that they freed. And then there's 7 prisoners whose heads are on pikes. They're dead faces looking at it. So I don't know.
Like, she traded in her knitting needles for weapons.
She did. Yeah. And she's like covered in weapons. She's got them everywhere. Described that earlier on. They're just everywhere. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the chapter. Like I said, it is mid-July in Paris, 1789. And yeah, it's begun, right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty gruesome and disgusting. And there's a lot in history that we can't really judge, but I still can't understand that. Like, watching your children be killed under the wheels of a carriage or just starving to death for no reason other than the selfishness of the aristocracy, or just all the suffering that they went through. Yes, definitely I understand their need for change. Absolutely. Did it need to be that gruesome and gory? I just don't.
I kept thinking that as I was reading this. I was like, okay, you wanted change because it wasn't right what was going on, but like what you did to get the change also wasn't right.
It also wasn't right. And what we know now is that it didn't work.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the right method at all.
Yeah, I think you can't ever like fight evil with evil, right? Or
you never can.
Violence with violence.
Exactly. Because, and it makes me think about the saying that like an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind, right? Because where does it stop?
Right.
It doesn't. You keep going and going until you find you're killing everybody and everything, and down the road, one of the final straws of the French Revolution was the fact that they ended up beheading Robespierre, who was like one of the guys who like at the head of all of the whole thing, So,
well, I think in a couple of chapters too, we'll find out like the people can't even be sure who's helping them and who's not.
Right.
So they're killing people, and like, who knows if, what side those people actually were on or whatever. And I always used to think that about like, I guess wars and stuff is like how, or, in movies when you see fights, it's like, how do you know who's on your side? How do you?
Yeah. Well, especially when it comes to like hand-to-hand combat, right?
Yeah.
Like, which was really why, like in the time of knights, they like had to wear their crests and their special clothing because it was like, that's the only way to tell when you're in the midst of this bloody battle who to not kill,
Right. Do I attack you or not? I don't. No, this is crazy. It is. And some chapters are fine and some are very gory and gross, but anyways, and Madame Defarge is
right in the middle of it.
Yeah, right.
She's wild.
Okay, so chapter 22. These chapters, I think the last one had the word, no, it did not. But the next few chapters have the word the sea in the heading. And I kind of liked what he did with it. Like the sea, he like likens it to the mob and like how when they come, he call it's like waves. And anyways, I thought that was kind of interesting. So chapter 22 is called The Sea Still Rises. Because I think chapter 21, it was like footsteps, right? Yeah.
Yeah, she talks about the echoes, but they have referred to the people as like storms, oceans, things like that. We have gotten that metaphor before, but now he like hits that metaphor really hard, I think. And it's very appropriate. It's like crashing over things kind of out of control and all encompassing. And once you're caught in the waves, it's like you're done for.
Yeah. Have you ever been in a sneaker wave or whatever?
Fortunately, no, but I'm terrified of that because
Very scary.
there was, there's a girl that we knew that her really good friend several years ago, remember when she was killed by a sneaker wave
Yeah.
just on the Oregon coast.
When the kids were little, we were on a trip up in the northern Oregon coast, and our dog, who's now like 13, was a puppy at the time, and David and the kids and my dad had gone out to the beach, and I was coming, and when I got over, you know how like there's like the sand hill, so it was like climbing over the sand hill. When I looked out, David and my dad were dragging kids out of the ocean and like all of our stuff was floating in the ocean.
Oh my God.
A sneaker wave had come in and just like wiped them out. And
wow.
Like our dog would have been gone, except that he was on the leash. David like totally forgot about him because he was trying to save the kids. And so he was just like dragged by the leash. And anyways, so my dad like literally saved Audrey. And
oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, it sounds like, yeah, they saved everybody's lives. Good.
It's crazy. I know.
That
I was
is
like
so terrifying.
And Audrey's afraid of the ocean now. And
oh, I bet. Yeah, that's traumatizing.
It was like it was very scary. So yes, we've experienced a sneaker wave before.
Yeah.
And it's like there's nothing you can do, basically.
Yeah.
I was so glad the kids were all like within distance that they could grab them and stuff.
Yeah. Anyways. Totally.
Okay. So yes, I liked that metaphor of the sea, and he talks about it a lot through here. But okay, so Madame Defarge is now like the leader of the females in the revolution. And like we talked about earlier, she's out for blood.
She is. And the other women are too. And I think that it's really interesting, sort of this, whenever you get women involved in a cause, they are like even more passionate about it than the men, and like even more gung-ho, ruthless. Even like the Nazi women, they were more ruthless than even the men, which is hard to rival, but they often were, and then you get these French revolutionary women, they were pretty awful.
I wonder if it has something to do with like the mama bear.
Yeah, and it could be like it. We'll probably talk about it, but it does kind of go through and talk about, like this anger is coming from just where this anger is coming from.
Yeah.
So
yes. Okay. So Madame Defarge is sitting at her counter, and I thought that was funny as usual. And she's presiding over her customers. And again, we talked about the rose. It says she wore no rose in her head. Which, did we figure out what that means? What the rose
was sort of a code. I believe that's kind of how it came across. A code to everybody that there was a spy present.
Okay.
So.
Oh yes. So that's what they're talking about, is that there are no spies. The spies don't dare come around.
They don't dare come around.
You're right. So if she has the rose in her head, then that means there's spies around. So she doesn't have it. But I loved this imagery. The lamps across the street had a pretentiously elastic swing with them. And I can just picture that, like the lamps swinging back and forth, like this eerie like, I don't know,
Yes.
omen.
And I do think that that's also another metaphor, because I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure those are bodies.
Like a foreshadowing of the bodies.
Well, like they're actual bodies.
Oh,
Because if when we're going to talk about the fate of somebody pretty soon,
yes.
and it talks about him basically being turned into a lamp. Like, and when they like walk through the streets with heads on pikes, it refers to those as like lamps. So
Okay.
I think that they are the elastic swing is because they are bodies.
Ugh. Okay.
Possibly like they've been hung. So like possibly hung over like lampposts or something.
Mhm.
But
Well, that
yeah,
could be what's keeping the spies out of the neighborhood.
I would say so.
If that's what that is.
Mhm.
So she's the leader, and then I love this too, that she has a second in command that they call the Vengeance.
Yeah.
And she's plump. She's the plump wife of a starved grocer and the mother of two children. And she must be scary because they call her the Vengeance. Monsieur Defarge brings some news in that an old aristocrat who used to say that the starving people should just eat grass. He's like, if you're hungry, just eat grass. That should do it. He brings in this news that he had faked his death. Like, well, I guess everybody had thought he was dead, right? And so he's coming in and saying, no, he's actually alive. He's been caught. His
Mhm.
funeral, right? I think you said that he had orchestrated his own funeral. It was all fake, and he's actually alive. And so the people are clearly not happy about that. Does everybody here recall old Foulon? Is that how you say it? Did I do
Pretty
that
good. Yeah.
good enough? Who told the famished people that they might eat grass, who died and went to hell? Everybody, the news is of him. He is among us. He's among us. And dead? He's not dead. So,
Not dead.
yeah, they found out that he'd faked
For
his
his
death.
sake, we wish that he was, but he's not.
Yes. So the mob gets together and they decide to go and storm the court building. And it says this about Madame Defarge. Instantly, Madame Defarge's knife was in her girdle. The drum was beating in the streets as if it and a drummer had flown together by magic. And the Vengeance, uttering terrific shrieks and flinging her arms about her head like all the 40 Furies at once, was tearing from house to house, rousing the women. So they're gathering everybody to go and storm the courthouse.
Yeah. There's one thing that I wanted to point out too, is that it says the men were terrible in their bloody minded anger, but the women were a sight to chill the boldest, because they're after Foulon. And it's worth noting here that this is a true story. This part is not fiction. The way that Dickens describes this event, it really did happen. His name was Joseph Francois Foulon. He says in here that he was about 70 years old when this happens, and he was an aristocrat, and the people hated him, and everything we're about to talk about did actually happen. So they had a ton of anger towards him. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't imagine. He's 70. That's like, I don't know. It's one
The
thing.
grandpa.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah.
They're all storming this court. We've got the Defarges, the Vengeance, and Jacques III, who I think are all out for blood, basically.
Oh, always.
The leaders, right? Is that what I'm getting? They're kind of the leaders.
Yeah.
Okay, so they go in and they find this. Well, it's just Foulon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't call him like anything like that. It's just yeah, they just use his name. And they drag him out of the courts and they beat him and they stuff his mouth with straw, which is kind of I mean not ironic, but they do it because that's what he told them they should just go eat grass. So they're now stuffing his mouth with straw to mock him, I guess. Is that the word?
Well, yes. And it's as they are killing him, because they take him, they're determined to hang him, take him to what I assume is a lamp. And they keep saying we should stuff his mouth with grass as we're killing him. And I don't know if they do that, but after he is dead, then they do.
They do. Okay, so they do it after he's dead.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I highlighted this: down and up and head foremost on the steps of the building, now on his knees, now on his feet, now on his back, dragged and struck at and stifled by the bunches of grass and straw that were thrust into his face by hundreds of hands. I That's just a picture, hundreds of hands, torn, bruised, panting, bleeding, yet always entreating and beseeching for mercy. So he's like, yeah, I just don't
It's
know how
pretty,
people
it's
do
pretty
this.
awful. I don't know. Yeah. And they keep trying to hang him is what they're doing.
It
And
keeps
the rope,
breaking,
it
right?
keeps breaking. He keeps falling, and then they like do it again. And finally, it even says the rope was merciful and held him. And it was like, I mean, that sounds awful, but for his sake, it probably was merciful that he finally died. And then,
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading that somewhere that it like the rope kept break or it wouldn't hold him and then it finally did. And then they end up hanging him from a lamp post. And then what is interesting about this after all this happens, it's funny because they go and do all this to him, right? And it's like violence and murder, and then they just go back to their houses and like,
well, they do, but first they kill his son-in-law. They've killed him. He finally is hung, and then his head was sewn upon a pike with grass enough in the mouth for all San Antone to dance beside him. And then it says that that was not the end of the day's work, because his son-in-law was coming into Paris. They found out he was supposed to have a big guard, but they still seized him and would have torn him out of the breast of an army to bear Foulon company. They set his head and heart on pikes and carried the spoils of the day in wolf procession through the streets. So pretty nasty. But then, like you say, they just go back to their kids.
yeah, they're starving children.
Mhm.
They say that a lot. Like, so yeah, I mean, they're going back to the reason they're doing this, that their situation is awful. Yeah, so they just go back to their starving children and lovers. Down. It says scanty and insufficient suppers those, and innocent of meat, as of most other sauce to wretched bread. Basically, I think they're getting their sustenance from being around each other because they don't have, from their relationships because they don't have food. Defarge says that he is happy that the revolution has finally come, and his wife says, almost.
Yeah.
So I think she knows it's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse. There's more.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting too, this very last paragraph, it talks about how the sound of the drum is the only voice in San Antone that blood and hurry had not changed. So all these things that they've done and are doing, it has changed the people. It talks about how it's made their voices hoarse, but it does. As soon as you start engaging in that kind of bloodthirsty, just murder,
Yeah.
it's going to change you. And we see that, and we're just going to continue to see that. So, okay, 23, fire rises. So we're going back to the village that was overseen by the chateau owned by the Monseigneur, the Marquis, who was murdered in his bed. I don't know the name of this village. I don't think it ever actually names it, but this is where the mender of roads is. So we're going back to him, and he's just working away. It keeps saying Monseigneur, but really when it says Monseigneur, it's really just referring to the whole nobility class. That they have this idea, like it says, strange that creation designed expressly for Monseigneur should be so soon wrung dry and squeezed out. There must be something short-sighted in the eternal arrangement, surely. And so it's like the aristocratic class had this idea that God had created everything for them. So why should anything be going wrong? That's not fair to them. you know? And so there must be something short-sighted. God must have screwed up if things are not going well. But the truth was that the aristocracy had squeezed it and wrung it out. They'd squeezed out the land, they'd squeezed out the people and wrung them dry to where just with these lofty ideas, there's no groundedness to them. They don't realize like there is a process to things. Like people have to be able to work the earth, and in order to work the earth, they have to be fed and they have to be happy and they have to like want to work it. And you know, but they had no concept of any of this. Another thing that I thought was interesting too is that it talks about the mender of roads. He's working and he's toiling along, and he doesn't think about how dust he was and to dust he will return, because all he's thinking about right now is how little he had for supper and how much more he would eat if he had it. And this really does go back to the idea that when you do not have your basic necessities met, very little else matters. Like you're not going to worry about academics. You're not going to worry about music or art. In this case, he's not worried about scriptures he's been taught. He's just worried about the fact that his stomach is empty and there's never enough, you know? Anyway, as he's working along, this man comes up to him. It says he's a shaggy-haired man of almost barbarian aspect. He's tall in wooden shoes. He's obviously traveled quite a long way, and he's not totally sure about him, and the stranger's not totally sure about the mender of roads. But the first thing the stranger says is, "How goes it, Jacques?" And he responds, "All well, Jacques." So there's their little code name, right? So now they know they're kind of on the same side. This guy is like super tired. So he says, "I'm going to lay down for a little bit. When you're done working, please wake me up." And so the mender of roads does. And then when he wakes the stranger up, he points him in a direction. He gives him directions to a specific place. We don't know what it is yet, but they take off. And we also find out they're all wearing red caps, which if you read much about the French Revolution, that kind of becomes one of their things. Like all the revolutionaries, they wear these red wool caps, and they also have their little ribbons that are the French colors, the colors of the French flag. Anyway, but it's all about that red cap. So the stranger takes off one direction. The mender of roads goes back into the little village and kind of like whispers this message around the fountain, and the message spreads around the village, and everybody comes out, and they just come out and they fold their arms and they just watch. And in due course, you see that the big chateau, which they can see from the village, that did belong to the Marquis who is dead, it is set on fire, and it's set ablaze. It is just totally destroyed. So this stranger who had come, he met up with some others, and they came, and their job was to burn down the house of this aristocrat. There were like some servants working in the house, and they left, and they're like, somebody help, and everybody just stands at the fountain and just watches. They're not going to do anything, right?
Said they were worried about the valuables inside there.
Right.
That's why
right.
he's like, "Help, there's expensive things in here," and they all just look at him. We're not going.
Yeah, we don't care. Unfortunately, Monsieur Gabelle he's sort of like not really a governor, but he's kind of like there to keep order in the town in a way. But it talks about how he had been sort of employed by the Marquis, but he'd never like collected rent from the people. He didn't tax them. But as soon as they'd seen the chateau burning down, the people got that sort of bloodthirsty feeling, and they wanted vengeance on everybody, right? And so they turned on Monsieur Gabelle, and they said, "We want, a personal conference with you." And he's like, "Nope." So he barred himself in his house and climbed up on his roof, and the people are like banging at his door all night long. But he's like, "If they break into my house, I will jump off my house, jump off my roof, and I will at least maybe take a couple of them out as I die myself. But he would rather do that than be submitted to, the horrors of what a mob can do. And we also find out that these, there's this group that's going around to like all these villages all around, burning down chateaus, and there's like different outcomes in different villages. Oh, and I do want to point out too that there's actually like soldiers and officers stationed at this village. They did nothing. They just kind of stood there. So in other villages, other things happened. And some of them, they burned the chateaus down, and the people would immediately turn on the governing bodies, and they would kill them, like just, murder them. In some places, the soldiers would actually turn on the people, and some of the people were killed. Some of the, just regular peasants, villagers, they were killed. So different outcomes came, but all in all, it was just a bloody, awful, destructive night all the way around.
Yeah, like it just said, they called them functionaries. So that's what Gabelle was. And the other functionaries were not so lucky.
Not so lucky. Right. Yeah. There's the word. Very good.
I know. I was like, functionaries. He's not a governor. He's just
right.
Whatever that word means, a functionary.
Yeah. Yeah. And it says that he did survive the night, and he came, let's see, in the morning, he came down bringing his life with him for that while. So
for now.
So,
right.
And that leads us right into chapter 24, the last chapter for now.
Yes. So now it's 1792, and it's been 3 years. It's funny how we do these jumps, right? 5 years, 3 years, every once in a while. Yeah. So yes. So this is 3 years later, 1792. And there's been a lot of battles and bloodshed all over. And because of this, the French nobility have kind of scattered all over. Okay. So they've scattered all over, and they've kind of become immigrants. So they're not what they used to be, I guess. And so they are leaving France and coming to London, and they are all kind of gathering at Tellson's Bank to get news. That must be their, I don't know. So they're not hiding, but they're just leaving France, right?
Right. Because they don't have to hide in England, but they do. They kind of gather at
the bank.
Tellson's Bank. They talk about how it's sort of like a high exchange. So it's the hub.
Yeah. Okay, so in the bank, Charles and Mr. Lorry are having this conversation. Charles wants to go back to the Paris branch to try and save a bunch of the documents that are in the bank there. And Mr. Lorry, I think, does not think it's a good idea. And they kind of talk. Go ahead.
It's just reversed. Mr. Lorry wants to go. He's saying that he's going to go, and Charles is telling him it's not a good idea.
You're right. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Like backwards, I switched them. Right. So Charles is trying to talk Mr. Lorry out of going.
Yeah.
It's a bad idea because it's really hard to get things in and out of France. Like it's impossible, basically, is what he says. Things don't move out very well. Mr. Lorry says that he's going to take Jerry Cruncher for protection.
I know. I kind of love that. I'm like, I kind of hate Jerry Cruncher, but at the same time, I love that he's like, they'll just see him as an English bulldog.
He's good when he's good.
Yeah.
And bad. I don't know. Like he's good at this. So we're going to use him. He's going to take Mr. Cruncher, and they're going to leave that night. Mr. Lorry is given a letter that is addressed to Marquis Saint Evremont. And we know who this is. This is Charles, right? Nobody else there knows that it's actually addressed to Charles, including Mr. Lorry. So he gets this letter. Then they kind of go into the people at the bank kind of go into this discussion about how they know that the Marquis had a nephew that basically betrayed his family or whatever.
That's what they say. Yeah.
Yes. And that he's a coward, basically, right? He says he's a coward and that for betraying his family. And I just think it's really funny. And Charles doesn't say anything. He just kind of listens to him. And then he says, I know who the nephew is. I know who this is. So I'm going to take him the letter. So basically, the letter is from Gabelle, who after that night was arrested and charged with treason for helping an immigrant, which must be Charles, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he basically says in the letter that, where we find out that he was doing Charles a favor by helping the people, but the people didn't know or care that that's what was going on. They just want to punish him anyways, or they just don't understand.
No, they don't, because really he's like, I have carried out everything that you said. Like I haven't charged them rent. He said, I haven't, taken any taxes. He's like, whenever there's extra food, I make sure that they have it.
Yeah.
And this is all according to what you asked me to do. And yet they've still arrested me, and it's very likely that I will die unless you intercede in my behalf.
Yeah. So he's like, basically the letter after that is like, please help me. He begs
Yeah.
Charles to save him, actually. And you know who Charles is, right? He's noble and loyal. And so he realizes that he needs to go to Paris and help Gabelle.
And I think it's really interesting here that he's like, he realizes, it's not fair what all these nobility people are saying about him, because they are so arrogant in their ignorance. It talks about how they have, to them, this French Revolution, like, who knew where it came from? Like, why would the people be having a problem? So awful. But at the same time, he does realize that as sort of the heir of the chateau, he was also the heir of the village, and he should have made sure that everything was really taken care of. Yes, like he left some instructions for Gabelle, but it just wasn't quite enough. So it's like he realizes that even though he didn't want to be the Marquis, he didn't want anything to do with that, he did have some responsibilities as the heir that would just be completely left undone if he just disappeared. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the people are angry at him.
Yeah.
And does that make sense?
Yeah. He's like, he didn't do enough. Like he sort of did his job, but
yeah, it's like he wasn't oppressive and he was trying to help them, but it wasn't enough.
right.
So he didn't leave it in good order. And he realizes that.
Right. And then he also kind of thinks that he can, if he goes in, he can help stop the violence or make it better, or maybe try to get the people to be more merciful, less
Yeah. He kind
bloodthirsty.
of has this sort of strange delusion that he could be like this leader and this savior to jump in and be like, look, everything's going to be okay and everybody's going to rally around him and it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
I think he just had no concept of what was really going on there.
And then it talks about, this is funny, that it kind of, what's the word, likens him to the lodestone rock, which is a magnetic rock. So like he has to go to Paris and he has to fix this. There's nothing that can stop him. Okay. And so Charles gives Mr. Lorry a verbal reply saying he's coming, the Evermond will come. And then that night he doesn't tell Dr. Manette and Lucy that he's leaving. I think he just has like a normal night, right? But he does secretly write them letters to get in the mornings.
So one of the letters was to Lucy, explaining the strong obligation he was under to go to Paris and showing her at length the reasons that he had for feeling confident that he could become involved in no personal danger there. So he's like, he does tell her that he's going to Paris. He just doesn't feel like she should know until he's actually gone.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, everything's going to be fine. I'm going to, deal with these issues and there's no danger. And then the other letter was to his father-in-law, the doctor, and he basically just says, please, watch out for Lucy and little Lucy.
Yeah. And he tells them both he'll write back. Like as soon as he gets there, he'll write them and tell them
that he got there and everything.
Yes. So that's the end of book 2.
Yes. And sort of this ominous last line, it says, he left all that was dear on earth behind him and floated away for the lodestone rock. Thing that he could not resist. He had to go to it because it was drawing him to it. The end of the second book. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. So next week we'll do book 3, chapters 1 through 8, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, the track of a storm is the book the 3rd. So I bet a lot of stuff is going to happen.
Yeah. Well, you see it just ramping up, and you kind of, I don't know, like there's a couple chapters in there that we just talked about that kind of take your breath away, that you go, oh my gosh, is this for real? But it was.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's crazy.
And it just gets worse.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's
That's
wild.
funny.
So good stuff though. Okay. So what book do you want to share with us tonight?
So today I was reading a book. This is really funny. Called One's Company by, I'm looking, hold on. I never know who books are from. By Ashley Hutson, like Hut, Hutson.
Mm.
Okay, this is really interesting. So this girl goes through something horrific. Like I think she's like raped and beaten, and like she's at her job, and all this is very brief. All like, and it just says it happened to her. All like her bosses and are shot. She's shot. Anyways, I think the where she works gets burglarized or something like that. So, anyways, she has this horrible traumatic experience, and after she gets out of the hospital, and the doctor says you need to go stay with somebody. So she goes and stays with a friend, and she discovers the show Three's Company. And she like becomes obsessed with it. Do you remember that show from like when you were a kid?
I remember hearing about it. I don't know.
Oh my gosh. It was like these 3 single adults that lived in an apartment together, and like
Okay.
John Ritter and Suzanne Summers. I can't remember the other lady's real name, but it was a funny show. Like I can't remember the guy. Anyways, they have like these crazy neighbor and his wife that are the landlords, and they're always like super nosy and come over. And anyways, it is just a funny show. So this girl, like to cope with what she's going through, becomes obsessed with Three's Company. Well, then she wins the lottery, and so she decides to build a replica of the Three's Company like set.
Oh my god.
And live in it.
Oh my gosh.
It's very funny. Like
That is really funny.
It's just kind of, yeah. And I think her goal, I'm not, I'm like halfway through it. I believe that her goal is to like live there and not have contact with anybody else ever. So I don't know how that's going to go for her, but so right now she's like looking for properties to build this Three's Company set on. Anyways,
that is so funny. It kind of makes me think that the author was sort of living out her fantasy through this writing or something. I don't know. Maybe
we had a babysitter that lived down the street from us when I was a little kid who was obsessed with Three's Company.
Oh, really?
She had every episode taped on VHS. And so when we would go, her mom also ran a daycare, so she'd babysit us down there, and we'd watch Three's Company with her.
That is so funny. I've never seen any of it, so I'll have to look it up.
It's it made me think today. I was like, when I'm done with this book, I'm gonna want to watch a few episodes just to reminisce, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit of nostalgia.
Yeah. I think it was like at the time, I mean, now you couldn't compare it to anything we watch now, but at the time, I believe a lot of parents didn't let their kids watch it just because it was kind of like single adults that were like dating, and I don't know.
Yeah.
Ask my mom if I'm remembering right, that she would have been like, I don't know if you should watch that. Now it's probably G-rated compared to everything we watch now.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Anyways, it's kind of interesting. It was on Hoopla, so it was available now, and that sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah. How about you?
And it's kind of different. So
Oh, totally different.
yeah. So I kind of love that. Cool. Okay, so this one that I'm going to share is also different for me. I so a little while ago I read one that was considered a psychological thriller, and I shared about it on here, but so I wanted something else, but I was like, I don't know much about psychological thrillers. Don't really love the idea of reading Stephen King because that's kind of like psychological horror, whatever. I wanted something that like really engages your brain and like twists and turns and stuff. So I kind of looked it up and got some ideas on a book list. So this one was like very highly recommended. It was like, I think it might have been on the Reese Witherspoon book club, whatever. So I was like, all right, I'll try it. So it's called The Last Mrs. Parrish. To me, have you heard of it?
I think I've read part of it and I didn't
Have
like
you?
it, but
So yeah, because that's the thing. I was like, for me, I felt like it was pretty predictable and kind of cliche. There were things about it that I was like, okay, like, exploring different aspects of life, whatever. But basically it centers around two women, and there's one woman who's like so jealous of rich people. Like that's all I can say. Like she just sees their life as being so perfect and it's so unfair. And so she decides to pursue wealth by seducing this really rich man, convincing him to divorce his wife, and then she would install herself as the next Mrs. Parrish and be very wealthy herself, right? She's kind of a horrible person, but she's also a really good actress, and she becomes best friends with Mrs. Parrish. And anyway, as we dive into it, we find out that like things are not as they seem with the Parrishes, and there's all kinds of orchestration going on both sides. But I think that it does end up in the best way that it could, but I don't know. I can't like recommend it. I didn't think it was like great, and there's lots of stuff that it's like pretty disturbing. So
I'm pretty sure I did not finish it. But I do remember that the premise, like that she decided to become best friends, but she's actually moving in on her husband.
yeah,
Which,
totally.
yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. And I will say, like, it works out the best for the former Mrs. Parrish. Like, it really actually does. So, in that way, there's a little bit of uh, vindication. But
Maybe I'll have to pick it up again and finish it just to see.
yeah, it wasn't like, it just wasn't the greatest writing. Like I said, it was a little bit cliche and predictable, but it was fine.
Well, I'm impressed that you
Fine.
finished it. I don't remember if I finished it, but I don't think so because I would
Yeah.
remember more.
You probably would remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I can trust book lists like that anymore. It's hard. It's hard to have a credible source for good books. We're so happy you joined us for this episode. We hope you will join us next week as we discuss A Tale of Two Cities Part 3, chapters 1 through 8. If you have suggestions for books we should read and discuss, please email us at thebestbookspodcast@gmail.com. We would love it if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts and share our podcast with your friends. We want to inspire and encourage as many people as we can to read out of the best books.
As Thoreau says, read the best books first, or you may not have a chance to read them at all. See you next week.